aloha mai kako. Aloha pume hana kako. Mahalo nui for joining us for this video at Te Whare Wānanga o Waikato, or the University of Waikato. My name is Dr. Keakaokawai Hemi. I am grateful for the chance to speak on behalf of Dr. Sarah Jane Tiakiwai and our project team today. Dr. Tiakiwai is unable to be here today due to illness, and we both wish that we could be with you in person. But we send our aloha and best wishes to you all, to our colleagues who are presenting, to those who are attending, and those who have put so much time and effort into making this conference happen. To begin with, I'll pose a question. What do you see in this photo? At first glance, this seems like an ordinary mat. The palette is simple, the colors muted, the chevron pattern is dominant, obviously geometric. The section looks rough, or a section here and there looks rough, unfinished, maybe even a little damaged or worn. And there are gold bits which may seem even random. But this mat is full of stories. This beautiful mat is called Te Whariki Takapau and was woven by Christine Hurihia Wirihana for the late Matu Dixon. Teacher, mentor, colleague, lawyer, composer, and weaver. The golden aho, or strands in the weave, are pingao from Matapihi near Matu's marae. The rough bits are meant to look as if children had run across the piece, like the pitter-patter of little feet, to give life to it and speak of generations. Knowing these stories and not knowing them is the difference between Matu's mat being just something to sit on and the art, the storytelling, and the real people it represents. This weaving for a weaver hangs in Te Piringa Faculty of Law here at the University of Waikato, where Matu wove law into stories and people together with aloha in his classrooms. I remember his classroom being the first time that I, as a first-year law student, had ever been taught at any school in the way I was taught at home. I was Kanaka Maoli, Kanaka o Iwi, with heritage from Laie, Oahu, and the beautiful islands of Hawaii, and he was Nai Te Rangi and Te Whakatohea descent, raised on Matakana Island and in Tarangamoana. But the way he taught with a patient ne, always getting us to come along with the lecture, his humor, his spirituality, his long memory and intelligence, it all reminded me of spending time with my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, and the experience of what now is called talanoa, and also what we called talking story. Matu's teaching reminded me of all that. It reminded me of home. Matu was an amazing teacher who influenced the course of my life as a learner and also a teacher. In a kind of full circle, I ended up teaching some of those same classes. His legacy as a teacher, his weaving of people and learning, and the stories that Matt tells are not unlike the research we undertook for the data-formed initiatives to enhance Māori and Pacific Student Achievement Project. The project now published as a report called Weaving the Mat of Māori and Pacific Learner Success. Today I want to share some of the stories in our mat of Māori and Pacific Learner Success. Our project team hopes this will be of value to other institutions seeking to create systemic change and better outcomes for Māori and Pacific students. Given the limited time for our presentation, I will speak briefly about the woven methodology we adopted, more on our initial findings and the two cultural legacy informed initiatives we developed from those findings, evidence on the impact of those initiatives on first-year Māori and Pacific achievement, and ongoing learning and institutional impact. Throughout my presentation, I invite you to think of our Māori and Pacific learners as the pingao, the gold in the mat of learner success that we seek to weave. The aims of the project were to develop institutional capability to create cohesive systems, programs, and experiences that are inclusive, culturally responsive, rewarding, and fulfilling for Māori and Pacific students. Establish teaching and learning initiatives and environments across the university that are informed by detailed data analytics combined with a rich student voice. Produce research that could have tangible benefits for Māori and Pacific learners, families, iwi, communities, and organizations, but also for tertiary institutions seeking to create transformative institutional change to improve educational outcomes for Māori and Pacific learners. And finally, to provide evidence for and better articulate the impact of data, literature, and Indigenous voice-informed learning support initiatives on such outcomes. To accomplish these aims, we chose to adopt weaving as a metaphor for how and what we would do. The project's methodology carefully wove whakapapa and whanaungatanga between Māori and Pacific learners and research project staff. This methodology was grounded by core aho, or strands, including kōrerorero and talanoa, or dialogue-based relationships, mo'olelo and purakau, telling one's own story, Indigenous self-determination and participation, and research as shape and power, but not the source. This was reserved for Indigenous voice. In the weaving of our methodology, students were considered the pingao, and Indigenous voice was unapologetically prioritized. In order to weave richer stories in the mat, we could not depend on one source alone, although we would be data informed. Research stages included the following. Phase 1, literature review. What works and why? What evidence do we already have for what works? What have Māori and Pacific researchers, learners, families, and communities already told us about what works? Phase 2, development of data and learner analytics and tools. What do we know? What can we know? How can we use data tools to improve Māori and Pacific learner success? Phase 3, Māori and Pacific student voices. What do students think? What have they experienced? What can we learn from them to improve Māori and Pacific learner success more generally? And we propose to do this through Wānanga for Māori students and Whānau for Pacific students. Phase 4, data-informed initiative enhancement and development. How can we tailor initiatives using literature, data, learner analytics, and student voice to improve Māori and Pacific learner success? Phase 5, cohort tracking and further findings. How is it going and how can we do even better? What evidence can we see that these initiatives are having an impact on Māori and Pacific learner success? Phase 6, the final phase. Learnings and further application. What are some of the lessons that we learned during this project? What work do we still have ahead of us? How will we incorporate our learnings into that work? Now, weavers know that weaving relies on the right amount of tension being applied during the weaving at key points in the weaving. COVID-19 acted like this tension in our project. Dr. Keakaokawai and I presented our initial findings on the project, as it happened, at a large conference in the Washington, D.C. area in early February 2020, the same week that media headlines were filled with coverage of a cruise liner quarantined in Japan. We returned home to help with the university's efforts to transition modes of teaching, of learning, and supporting students, and staff experiencing various challenges outside of the classroom too. The COVID-19 pandemic presented certain challenges, but it also gave us a unique opportunity to test findings and learn from student experience and voice that would have been hard to reproduce in any other way. Although it impacted timelines and interaction with students at times, this tension in the weave was also invaluable in the insights it provided. Our initial findings from the literature review, data analytics, and tools, and from student voice gave us a good foundation for crafting initiatives and going forward. So what were the literature, data, and voice telling us? What were we seeing in our mat when we wove MAORI and Pacific voice in with quantitative data, for instance? After analyzing our findings, here are a few of our takeaways. These were distinct threads or patterns in the weave. First, Pacific learners frequently identify themselves as the first in family, and many MAORI students do as well. Both groups say that not having family members understand what study entails, including time for study and space for study, is a barrier to success. Financial pressures are a big barrier for both groups. Understanding and encouraging employers are a plus. Many attend because of the government's first-year fees-free policy. Both groups are challenged by the added expense of caring for family members and upholding cultural responsibilities. As in the literature, our students constantly and consistently confirmed that whānau, ainga, and family are the most important factor enabling success and need to be part of the equation. Both groups are motivated by being examples to younger siblings, breaking stereotypes, giving back to communities, and, quote, not wanting to waste their parents' sacrifice, unquote. We know that creating success in the first year and first semester is crucial. Our data shows dramatic differences in pass rates and pass quality between level 100 and other levels. Pacific students in their third and fourth year told us that they usually seek help from lecturers they built relationships with in their first and second years. Environment and people are also crucial. For instance, those people called aunties, uncles, and cousins in staff and student associations. Our MAORI students value tuakana tena peer mentoring and networks and staff relationships. Pacific students call support staff aunties and uncles. For Pacific students, lecturers with open door policies are a plus. For both groups, family members who attend or graduate from Waikato are positive role models. When MAORI and Pacific students succeed, their whole family succeeds. For both, success is intergenerational and redresses historical concerns, including colonization and underachievement. So together, and with other findings, these emphasize that what happens outside the classroom is as important as what happens in it. However, they also emphasize the importance of doing small things in a classroom, such as remembering someone's name, being approachable, and creating a welcoming learning environment. Building data analytic capability and tools required a certain amount of financial investment, but many of these success factors relied on people and relationships. This is our why and the strength of the weave. We wove our learnings from the literature, initial data, and student voice into two culturally responsive initiatives for MAORI and Pacific learners. Both are focused on transition to study for first-year students and encourage success through cultural values and legacies. Each has given us the chance to incorporate common success factors and distinct responses for MAORI and Pacific. While recognizing heterogeneity, i.e. that MAORI and Pacific people are distinct and diverse cultures and peoples, both recognize extra-institutional factors, the influence of whānau, ainga, and families, and history. They seek to address gaps and disparities, especially in retention, through optimizing transitions into study from the start of the first year, learning support services targeted to MAORI and Pacific, and building culture, community, and support on campus. The first is Te Kahui Pirere. The word pirere represents the baby bird leaving the nest and thus the challenges that come with moving into new spaces and growing older. As a kahui, or flock, Our students are constantly connected to another whānau and therefore not alone in this journey. Te Kahui Pirere is focused on supporting Māori students transition from the nest of their homes beneath the wings of their whānau into the new life and whānau of the university. The 2020 program involved a noho marae, workshops, social events, and regular check-ins during trimesters. All students who become part of the program were expected to attend these events. A crucial relationship-building event for the year, the noho marae, had students stay at a local marae for a weekend wānanga. The purpose of the noho was not only whakawhanaungatanga, but also an opportunity for students to discuss and set their own goals for the year, supported by tuakana, senior students, and program staff. The Imua Learner Leader Initiative is another cultural legacy-informed program for first-year Pacific students, launched in July 2020, very soon after we came out of lockdown. Imua is a Hawaiian phrase, sometimes written as imua, which means to go forward or lead from the front. It readily translates into many Pacific languages. The ability to imua is key to success in any endeavor, but especially in university study. This program is designed to help each student who participates to go forward and lead from the front in their own university journey. It aims to help every student to be a learner and every learner to be a leader. It stresses that no matter who you are or where you come from, whether you have been an honors student or are just getting by, you can imua in your tertiary education. Imua also focused on improving retention and setting students up for long-term success. It consisted of 3 modules: voyaging and learning, work and life balance, and leadership and excellence. During each module, students needed only to attend the Legacy Seminar with lunch and special guests from the Pacific community as speakers, and check in once during a certain time period with the Pacific Student Success Coordinator, and attend Pacific Student Learning workshops. Feedback from students who participate in these initiatives reflect common success factors for Māori and Pacific first-year learners, including utilizing whānau, ainga, and history to motivate as a strength, targeting and optimizing transitions into study, especially in the first year of study at university, increasing awareness of support available and starting relationships with support staff early, creating a sense of belonging and a safe space, providing role models that Māori and Pacific learners can relate to. How each program has built on these factors is unique, however. These initiatives leave room to address complex and diverse backgrounds, identities, cultures, and languages. That is, to also recognize the heterogeneity of Māori and Pacific students. The highlights and positives about the programs are also rooted in the fact that these programs are tailored to cultures, languages, and identities, as compared with the one-size-fits-all nature of many teaching and learning initiatives. This clearly resonates with both Māori and Pacific students who are looking to see themselves reflected in teaching and learning at university and to be able to be themselves while pursuing a tertiary education. Various stories emerged about our first-year Māori and Pacific students in various cohorts from the data we collected after Trimester B 2020 finished. In most cases, there was a measurable increase in standard measures of achievement where students participated in these cultural legacy-informed initiatives. So you can see on your screens some of the data that we collected. And so I'll let you just have your eyes wander over that just for a minute. But we tested a few things anecdotally. So as you're looking at that, you can see that as compared to Māori generally, first-year Māori students generally, Māori students who are in the halls where they receive additional support did a bit better when they were in the halls. In Te Kahui Pirere, in several measures, they also did better just by being in the program. However, for those who completed the program, the standards of achievement went up dramatically. And we can see something similar for Pacific students. So we could see anecdotally that Pacific students were receiving support, but we were able to see data that supports the idea that Pacific students in the halls also do better than their counterparts who are not in the halls. We were able to see that students who are in IMUA generally do better again than even the students in the halls. And we were able to see that those who completed IMUA did measurably better. And so those were some of the, really ways that we could confirm what students were saying to us. Now, the data further indicated that these programs were linked with potential parity and equity indicators, or in other words, often produced results which exceeded mere parity or just lining up the numbers. So in this next slide, you can see non-Māori, non-Pacific students compared with those in Te Kahui Pīrere, those who completed Te Kahui Pīrere, those in IMUA and those who completed IMUA. And the numbers in red are areas where the standards of achievement actually exceed non-Māori and non-Pacific students, thus making arguments not just for parity, but for a real substantive equity, which is something very pleasing that we're delighted to see. So some conclusions that we can draw from these numbers. Although some caution due to the smaller numbers is advisable, the outcomes for learners completing the TKP and IMUA program suggest the following. Learners completing these programs are experiencing outcomes that are not just meeting but exceeding parity with non-Māori and non-Pacific learners. Again, the low rates of withdrawal suggest that Māori and Pacific learners have been resilient during COVID-19. There is more work to do on pass rate quality for Pacific, which is less dramatic, but the figure is a vast improvement on the 3.69 for Pacific generally. The question now may be how we increase participation and completion in Te Kahui Pīrere and IMUA. An Olelo No'eau, or Hawaiian proverb, says, "E lave ike a'o o malama, a'e oi mauka na'auau," or, "He who takes his teachings and applies them increases his knowledge." So what have we learned? Although this is an ongoing process, we have developed greater institutional capacity through literature, voice, data, and initiatives. Cohort-specific initiatives informed by literature, data, and student voice, and evidence of the impact of such initiatives on Māori and Pacific student achievement. At a fundamental level, and this is really important for us, we have a better sense of what constitutes success for Māori and Pacific learners at Waikato, including success as Māori and Pacific people with identities, languages, and cultures intact, success as families, iwi, and communities, and the holistic well-being of families, iwi, and communities, as in the Fijian word sautu. Intergenerational success that results in wider equitable outcomes and prosperity for Māori and Pacific families, iwi, and communities. Disrupting racism and other forms of discrimination in classrooms and other learning experiences, as well as disrupting stereotypes, negative statistics, and deficit narratives. And better formed, culturally responsive teaching in classrooms, as well as a sense of belonging in all aspects of education, setting an example and being a role model for those that come after, and success as peer groups and in student associations. And finally, that educational outcomes result in not only gainful employment, home ownership, and financial well-being, but also the chance to do good in the world and contribute to the success of others. During the pandemic, everyday success included balancing family, work, and community responsibilities and adapting study in a challenging environment. Longer-term success included completing qualifications, overcoming digital inclusion issues, and intergenerational success despite intensified challenges. Current projects include the extension of Te Kahui Pirere to a whānau initiative, the digital enhancement of the Imua initiative to include, for instance, better access to digital devices, and more data-informed initiatives, including a new cultural competencies-based Māori and Pacific teaching initiative, the Heiti e Tasi teaching toolkit, and various data capability tools. So our research has already begun to inform key avenues for institutional change. For example, the Pacific Plan 2021 to 2025, which was passed by the University Council on the 15th of June 2021, and the University of Waikato Te Rautaki Māori o Te Whare Wānanga o Waikato 2022 to 2027, or the Māori Advancement Plan, which was passed just within the last month or so, and has also integrated Māori identity, culture, and language, and anticipated tailored approaches to Māori learner success in an unprecedented way, as has the Pacific Plan in regards to Pacific learners, staff, families, and communities. Writing about her work to correct inaccurate histories depicting Native Hawaiians as passive against events that would result in educational underachievement for later generations, Silva wrote that, quote, "When the stories can be validated, people begin to recover from the wounds caused by the disjuncture in their consciousness," unquote. Addressing the impact of colonization and systemic inequities, gaps, and disparities requires a validation of the experiences of Māori and Pacific students who have historically and chronically not been well served by tertiary education in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and in many other education systems. As a university seeking to overcome these challenges, we need to hear and validate those experiences for ourselves, to know the stories, and to understand the texture, color, and weave of the mat for ourselves. Just as importantly, we had the chance through corroboration and reinforcement to validate the work of Māori and Pacific researchers and the voices of Māori and Pacific learners, parents, and educators in the literature. Perhaps the greatest validation of all has been the voices of our very own students that have not only reinforced the data, but also shown that there are stories behind the numbers, adding greater texture and the pingao, the gold in the weave. Repeating patterns have spoken especially loudly. As we go forward, we know that we will need to continue to listen to our students, to hear their stories, and to keep the kōrerorero and the talanoa going. In this way, we will honor the weaving and the weavers, the learners and their families, the teachers and support staff who care and go the extra mile, and all those who weave people and instill confidence and a sense of belonging through education. Mahalo nui loa for listening.